שיר חדש, שירו לאדוני כל הארץ, שירו לאדוני, ברכו שמו, בסרו מיום ליום ישועתו, ספרו בגויים כבודו, וכל העמים נפלאותיו, כי גדול אדוני, מהולל מאוד, נורא הוא, הגואל דו-דו-דו-אפ, דו-דו-דו-אפ,
Good evening. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? That was Keepa Live, doing an a cappella version of the Carlebach Kabbalah Shabbos. It's Wednesday, so we can already start looking to Shabbos and even say good Shabbos. It's also Rosh Chodesh Av, so I'm purposely bringing it down a little bit in terms of the natural joy that I would feel when listening to such beautiful music. We're in the 9 days. We're counting the days to Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, when we remember and commemorate that the Holy Temple was destroyed. Both temples were destroyed on the 9th of Av, the first temple and the second temple. So during this 9 days, we have certain practices which are basically mourning practices. We don't shave, we don't eat meat, we refrain from wine, except on Shabbos with regards to meat and wine. We try not to wear freshly laundered clothes. We don't buy new clothes. We try not to get into new business deals. It's a whole bunch of stuff. And we don't listen to instrumental music. That's why during this whole period, even for the 3 weeks, starting from the 17th of Tammuz, we've been listening to a cappella music primarily, and certainly in the 9 days. Let's see who is with us today. We've got an amazing class, and Nina just reminded me before we started, this is the 200th episode of AT Daily. Started in January, didn't know if it was going to stick, didn't know if I was going to be able to do it. Here we are, 200 consecutive days of us learning together. Let's light up the darkness. Who is in the house with us for the 200th show? James D. Roth is number one. Shalom from Indianapolis. Melissa Eitel-Jurin, good evening from Great Neck, New York. Joyce Oxfeld, I think that's a new name. Welcome, Joyce, from Northeast Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Leona Sue Thacker, good evening, friends. She says, where am I? Ed Berg says, shalom from Galloway, New Jersey. Always great to see you, Ed. Harold Black says that Harold and Loretta are with us together from Oregon. Bill Eldridge from Berkeley says hello. Antonio Clark with us from Massachusetts. Bryna Bloomfield says Rosh Chodesh Tov from Cambridge, Massachusetts. John Shore is with us from Sedona, Arizona. Paula Gelman with us from Las Vegas. Paula Schmidt-Klauser says shalom from Chicago. Caroline Dobson Chavez says shalom from Raleigh, North Carolina. Eric Gretz is with us from Benson, Arizona. Chanel McDowell with us from says shalom from Michigan. Catherine Stately from Albuquerque. Sean Litvak. Hello, Sean. Maybe we're related. So great to have you with us here from Louisville, Kentucky. Caleb Adams from Wilkesboro, North Carolina. Eleonora Tamara Gross says shalom from Tewksbury, United Kingdom. It must be late for you, Eleonora. Great to have you with us. Vaughn Billow says shalom from Fremont, Ohio. Arnold Albin says good evening. So good to be together. We are home. He's with us from Northridge, California. Somber as it is, we come to the 9th of Av. Leah Meza says regards from Miami, Florida. Michelle Vizina Peterlin says shalom from Indiana. Kelsa Canedo says, this is how I survived being quarantined this long. Sue Strauss in the house from Chicago. Sandy McMurray says, good evening from Michigan. And Jorge Alves Santana says, it's Jorge from Goiânia, Brazil. Welcome, Jorge. Fantastic that you're with us over on the YouTube side. Neil is with us from Virginia. Miracia Janut says shalom from Miracia in Atlanta, Georgia. Marjorie Holler is with us from Tucker, Georgia. Neil says Yasher Koach Salanina, huge accomplishment. I assume he means with the 200th episode. And Deborah Hazelwood is with us and says shalom. Welcome, everybody. It's so good to be together. Big Daf, we are finally moving into a new chapter. So, where are we? We're holding on Daf 138, page 138. That is Kuf Lamed Ches. We are now opening chapter 20. Chapter 19 was all about the intersection of circumcision and the restrictions of Shabbos. Chapter 20, we're going to get back to, interesting, you wouldn't think, the intersection of construction, the restriction on construction on Shabbos, and food preparation. What do food preparation and construction, which are both prohibited on Shabbos, but how do they intersect? I mean, you think either you're, constructing, you're building, you're engaged in hammering nails and putting up the frame of a house or something, or you're in the kitchen cooking. How can these two things have an intersection? And today we shall see. Okay, the first Mishna of chapter 20. Rabbi Eliezer, let me just get this in front of me. Okay, and by the way, if you're following along in the text, we're actually on page 137 on the B side. That's where the new chapter begins. I just thought it would be better to start with a fresh chapter. So at the end of page 137b, we have the first Mishnah of chapter 20. Rabbi Eliezer says, we may suspend and stretch a strainer for wine on a festival. What is Rabbi Eliezer saying? I'm going to show you in one moment. He says that we may suspend, check it out, little demonstration tool. So this is the structure that the strainer is going to be hung on. Let's imagine that this is on some kind of a beam in the house or a hook or something in the kitchen, and it's going to hold up this ring. And the key is, so you just imagine a cloth. This is just a white t-shirt. But this is how they would strain wine in ancient times. Why would they strain wine in ancient times? Because wine was a different liquid, different, obviously made from grapes with alcohol in it, but they would get their wine from a barrel, and new wine, or I'm not going to distinguish between new wine and aged wine, but what I'm going to talk about is when they would get their wine, it would be very strong. They wouldn't drink wine from the barrel. They would dilute it. We saw this earlier in our journey. They would dilute it 4-to-1 with water, right? So wine was too strong to be drunk. It also had quite a bit of sediment in it, right? So you could drink the wine with the sediment in it. I don't think it would poison you, but it's more pleasant without that sediment, right? So they would put it through a strainer, not some kind of a fine mesh strainer like we have now. They didn't have the technology, I think, to produce such a fine mesh. So they would use a cloth. And what they would do is they would use the cloth like this, put it over the ring, right? Let me get this like that, right? And then they would tie the bottom, something like this. Hold on. Something like that, right? And I think maybe, like cheese is sometimes made this way. I don't know much about cooking cheese, but I know there's something like this with a cheesecloth. At any rate, this is what they would do with wine. This is now a wine strainer, and you would suspend this over like some kind of a vessel that would catch it, right? And it would be like this, and this would hang Pretty ugly, I know, but it would work. And then you'd pour your wine in there, and the wine would drip out through the cloth and minus the sediment. So Rabbi Eliezer says that on a festival, now recall the only difference between a festival and Shabbos, basically, pretty much, 99%, is that on the festival you can prepare food, you can cook food, and you can do the actions necessary to prepare food on the festival. Otherwise, Shabbos and festival have the same restrictions. You cannot work or do any of the other 38 categories of work besides food preparation. Okay, so Rabbi Eliezer says on a festival, you can create this structure and then you can strain the wine through it. That's what Rabbi Eliezer says. He says that, and Rabbi Eliezer says, you may not create this structure on Shabbos. You may not create the structure on Shabbos, but you can strain the wine through it if the structure was already created. The rabbis disagree with Rabbi Eliezer. They say we may not suspend the strainer on the festival, on Yom Tov, nor pass wine through it on Shabbos, but we may, if this thing was hung up before the festival began, we may pass wine through it on the festival, right? So to summarize, Rabbi Eliezer says we can create that strainer and hang it up on a festival, and certainly we can pass wine through it. On Shabbos, if it was already there, we can pass wine through it, but we can't create the structure. The rabbis disagree with Eliezer, and they say that you may not hang the strainer on a festival, and certainly not on Shabbos. You may pass wine through it on the festival. You may not pass wine through it on Shabbos. That's what the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Eliezer say. Now, so what we see is that Rabbi Eliezer is more lenient than the rabbis who disagree with him. He has a greater permission for what is possible on Shabbos and on the festival. Just yesterday, we were looking at a conflict between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua with respect to a circumcision that was committed in error on Shabbos. Just take the example of the 9th day baby. So the baby that was supposed to be circumcised on Friday, it was scheduled, they made a mistake. They didn't circumcise it on Friday, and instead they circumcised it on Saturday. This is prohibited because you can only do an 8th day circumcision, the circumcision on the day that it's supposed to happen when it's a mitzvah to do it. Then it overrides Shabbos. If, for example, there's a medical delay, then you wait till after Shabbos. You don't desecrate Shabbos for a post 8th day circumcision. We saw that Rabbi Yehoshua would say that that person who does that, who makes that mistake, he shouldn't have done it, but nevertheless, he does not become liable to bring a sin offering because he was engaged in a mitzvah. He was performing a mitzvah. The baby did need to be circumcised after the 8th day. A baby that's not circumcised at the soonest possible moment, you circumcise, you just wouldn't do that on Shabbos. Rabbi Eliezer said he shouldn't have done it. It was wrong to do that circumcision on Shabbat. He did it unwittingly. Certainly he didn't do it on purpose. And so he becomes liable to bring the sin offering. Why? Because he violated a Torah prohibition. What is the Torah prohibition? He inflicted a wound, right? When you make a circumcision, it's a wound. A little blood gets drawn. And so inflicted a wound on Shabbos, and he's liable to bring the sin offering. So there we saw Rabbi Eliezer was the more stringent opinion. Now we're going to have a series of opinions where Rabbi Eliezer is the more lenient one compared to other places where again we see that he's the more stringent one. So we are trying to ascertain, it's not always that one rabbi is known for being the tough and stringent one, and another rabbi is known for being the easy and lenient one. And if you want to make your life easier, go make that rabbi, the more lenient one, your rabbi. It just doesn't work that way. The rabbis hold according to their understanding of Torah. They're not trying to be easy or difficult. They're just making a ruling based on the truth as they see it in the Torah. So what's going on here? We saw that Rabbi Eliezer was also more stringent, and this is going to be related, these two holdings, to what we're seeing here. He was more stringent than the other rabbis with respect to putting a shutter on a window on Shabbos. In ancient times, Talmudic times, they didn't have the kind of, sort of high quality small hinges that we have today, where shutters are just sitting next to the window, and when you want to close the shutter, you just close the shutter. Back then, a shutter was either kept on the floor, and then when it was time to shutter the window, they would pick it up and put it in the window slot, or perhaps they would hang it on a rope from the wall or from the ceiling or from the window frame itself. The rabbis on Shabbos would permit you to pick up the shutter off the floor and put it in the window to shutter the window. Rabbi Eliezer would not. He held that this is construction, that if you attach something that's not attached to the house, it's like you're doing construction, and so he prohibited that on Shabbos. The rabbis disagreed with, and he prohibited unless it's tied to the ceiling or tied to the window or tied to the window frame or to the wall, because now it's already attached to the house and you're just moving it from the wall to in front of the window. The rabbis permitted this because, according to them, the shutter was prepared for this use before Shabbos. You're not holding that shutter to use it somewhere in your house, wherever the construction, project that your fancy might take you. That shutter was prepared for one thing, to put it in front of the window when it was time to put it in front of the window. And so the rabbis permit that on Shabbos. And the Rabbi Eliezer also parted company with the rabbis with respect to making a tent. And this is what this strainer, which just looks like, now it looks like a t-shirt on a ring on a hanger. But as we saw, I made it at the beginning of the section. If you're just tuning in now, this is a wine strainer, like the way they did in ancient times. They would put wine into that very strong and sedimenty wine, and the sediment would stay in the cloth and the wine would drip out the bottom. The rabbis are going to consider that like making a tent. And that's why it's prohibited to hang this on the festival. So with respect to tents, what we saw was that the rabbis, everyone agrees that you cannot erect a tent either on a festival or on Shabbos. Creating a tent, putting up a tent. You have a tent kit and you just erect the tent. You can't do that on Shabbos. You can't do that on a festival. Everybody agrees. But if you erected the tent before Shabbos or before the festival, then the rabbis hold that you can add a flap to it, right? So you can add a flap to kind of extend it out a little bit over the entryway, let's say, so that you're in the shade. You're only adding to that existing tent. You're not creating a tent. The rabbis permit that. Rabbi Eliezer said no. He was the more stringent opinion. He would not even allow you to add to an existing tent. So, why is Rabbi Eliezer going to be so lenient with allowing us to create this? Either Rabbi Eliezer doesn't consider that making this strainer is like making a tent, or he thinks that it might be like making a tent, but it overrides that restriction because preparing food, and particularly wine, which adds to the joy of the festival and the joy of Shabbos, is going to override what would otherwise be that restriction on making the tent. Now, his opinion is compared to Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Yehuda, let me just get it straight in front of me. Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Eliezer both are quite lenient in permitting not just that you prepare food, but the actions which allow you to prepare the food, right? Facilitators. We saw that in the case of a circumcision, a facilitator to preparing the circumcision was bringing the knife. And Rabbi Eliezer was lenient there, because if you didn't have the knife on the premises for the Shabbat circumcision, of the 8-day circumcision on Shabbos, Rabbi Eliezer held you can bring the knife. You can carry the knife through the public domain and from the public domain into the private domain. The rabbis said, no, you should have done that before Shabbos. If you didn't do it before Shabbos, the circumcision is going to be postponed. Rabbi Eliezer permitted the facilitator. Rabbi Yehuda is very permissive on food preparation and all the activities that are necessary to do food preparation on the festival. But if something could have been done before the festival, it should have been done before the festival. Rabbi Yehuda allows you to do the facilitators, the things that you could have done before the festival. Nevertheless, now you want to do them so that you can prepare food. Rabbi Eliezer is going to permit that. So he is a little bit more lenient than Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis with respect to food preparation on Shabbos, on the festival. I'm sorry, not on Shabbos. You can't prepare food on Shabbos, but on the festival. And the halacha, the law, is that we do not suspend the strainer. Okay, so Rabbi Eliezer lost this battle with the other rabbis. The rabbis won the argument. Oh, let me just turn this off here. Excuse me. And so the law is we may not suspend such a strainer on the festival because it is considered to be like making a tent. It is like making a tent. So we can't do that. We can pass wine through it on the festival if it was already put up before the festival, per the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. This is a facilitator to having the wine sediment free, but it should have been done before the festival. So we can pass wine through it. And on Shabbos, we cannot pass wine through it. Right? There's no food preparation. This isn't cooking. Is it really food preparation? What is it similar to? It's straining. Straining is not one of the 39 prohibited labors, but it's similar to the prohibited labors of sifting and selecting, both of which were activities that were necessary for the construction of the tabernacle in the desert. What are we doing here? We're not separating edible from inedible. That sediment is edible. We'd rather not eat it, but it's edible. We're making the wine a little bit more refined, so that seems to be pretty similar to sifting, but it is unclear whether it's sifting or selecting. Either way, the halacha, the law is we don't strain out the sediment of wine on Shabbos. Now, what's interesting about this is Abaye explains, this video has ended. Oh boy. All right. It ended on Facebook. I don't know why. It ended. We're going to have to just keep going. It just went black. There's been problems with Facebook all day. I think we're still live on YouTube. So we're just going to keep going here. And we'll post this video later. Okay, so if you're watching on YouTube, yeah, this is a exclusive class for you today. What a bummer that Facebook has been so nasty today. We weren't even able to publish the table for 5. Well, what can you do? God had other plans for us today. All right, let me keep going. So Abaye explains that stretching the strainer, creating this strainer on the festival, it is similar to making a tent, but it is not making a tent. Therefore, if we do it, we violated a rabbinic prohibition, not a Torah prohibition. That's the important difference. In other words, the rabbis said creating that strainer is similar to making a tent, but it isn't making a tent, right? So if you do it unwittingly, you're not supposed to do it. Either way, the law is you don't do it. But if you did it unwittingly because you didn't know it was a festival, for example, and you did it, so you become liable to bring a sin offering? No, you do not, because you only violated a rabbinic prohibition. It is prohibited, but you are exempt from the sin offering. And Abaye clarifies the law of all these tent-like structures. I'll just read that. Abaye would consolidate the principles of these baraisas pertaining to the construction of a tent on Shabbat. And then he said, 1, with regard to a large wineskin or a wine strainer, like we're talking about here, a canopy hung over a bed, and a folding chair whose cover is detached from its legs, one may not assemble them due to the restriction on making a temporary tent. If one did so unwittingly, he is exempt by Torah law. So that tells you right there, it's a rabbinic prohibition, not a Torah prohibition. Number 2, with regard to permanent tents, one may not make them, and if he did so, he is liable to bring the sin offering, right? To create a tent that's going to be permanent meaning it'll stay up until you take it down, and it's meant to stay up for a while. Let's say for, I don't know how many days is considered permanent, but it's more of a firm structure. So then it's a Torah violation. John Shore says Facebook is diminishing your joy. Very good, John. Okay, so one may not make. So Abai explains, if you make a permanent tent on the festival, now you're liable to bring the sin offering because you violated Torah prohibition. But with regard to a bed and a folding chair whose cover is attached to its legs, so that's like a regular folding chair. And with regard to a collapsible toilet, which is something they used in the old days, it is permissible to open them. It's permitted because these items are prepared for Shabbos, right? To bring out a folding chair because you have extra guests, you're not making a tent. It was in your mind that you would use that folding chair for guests if necessary. So those items are prepared. Okay. This is great. People are finding us on YouTube. I don't know what happened with Facebook. Today's been terrible on Facebook. Whatever. We're not going to keep talking about that. Okay, let's keep going. So, if one strained the wine, right? So we already saw that it's like creating a tent, but it's not creating a tent. So if you did it, you violated a rabbinic prohibition. You're not liable to bring the sin offering in terms of hanging it up. What about passing wine through it? So the rabbis say on Shabbos, you cannot pass wine through it. Rabbi Eliezer says you can. You can pass wine through this on Shabbos because it's not one of the prohibited labors, according to Rabbi Eliezer. The rabbis prohibit. So let's say you did it. So you did, put the wine through it. It was hung before Shabbos, so it's not about creating the structure. But now you pass the wine through it. You strain the wine. It's prohibited according to the rabbis. So the question is, are you liable to bring the sin offering? Did you violate a rabbinic prohibition, or did you even violate just a rabbinic prohibition, or did you even violate the Torah prohibition? That's the question. Rav Kahana says that you're liable. You violated a Torah prohibition, and that's what he learns out from the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer, as we said, permitted. Rav Shesha says, Rav Kahana, you got this all wrong. You must be wrong. Is it possible that Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis, the great Rabbi Eliezer, right? The great Rabbi Eliezer, who may disagree with the rabbis on several things, but he's one of the greatest sages in history. Is it possible that he would be so far apart from the rabbis that they are saying if you strain the wine through that strainer on Shabbos, you're liable to bring a sin offering because you violated a Torah prohibition, and Rabbi Eliezer would just permit that action outright, right? Could they be that far apart? Rav Sheshet says, no, it's impossible. Rav Yosef says, what are you talking about? I object to your objection. Why do I object to your objection? Because we have seen other cases where the rabbis can be this far apart, where they're so far apart, where they are so far apart that one permits and another one is holding that is a Torah prohibition. What is the case? A city of gold. We've learned about this before. So very wealthy women, right, had a kind of jewelry. If they were really rich and their husbands bought them the greatest gift that they could give them, it was called a city of gold. It was literally made out of gold, and it was basically a skyline of Jerusalem that they would wear on their forehead. So imagine sort of like a tiara, but in the shape of the Jerusalem skyline. It's called a city of gold. Famously, Rabbi Akiva, who is so impoverished for decades, and so is his beautiful and hardworking wife Rachel, who allowed him to learn Torah for all these years by working with her hands in abject poverty, even though she was the daughter of a very wealthy man. He disowned her because she married this illiterate laborer named Akiva. She believed in him. She was right. Akiva became not only learned, not only a rabbi, not only a sage, but probably the greatest sage in our history. And when they were young and they were in love and they were looking at their lives and they were in poverty and he saw what she gave up to be with him, he said, one day, I will get you a city of gold, like the nicest gift that a husband could give his wife in those days in terms of jewelry. So with regard to a city of gold, Rabbi Meir said, if a woman wears such a thing on Shabbos, right, because a city of gold was not appropriate for Shabbos, if she wears it on Shabbos and walks from one domain to another, meaning from the private domain to the public domain, or vice versa, she is liable to bring a sin offering. Why? She's wearing it. You can wear things. That's not really carrying. The problem is that the rabbis decreed that if you took off the city of gold, you might show it to your friend, and then you're going to carry it. Right? Now, that was a fence around the Torah to prevent the woman from coming to carry it in the public domain. But she hasn't done that yet. So by the rabbinic decree, it was prohibited to wear the city of gold, but you wouldn't be liable to bring the sin offering. I'm sorry, let me just get this in front of me. Something just happened. I have lost my place. Here we go. But Rabbi Eliezer, right, so it was Rabbi Eliezer, I just wanted to make sure, but Rabbi Eliezer permitted women to wear the city of gold. He said, hey, it's jewelry. You can wear jewelry. The fact that the rabbis decreed against it was too much. I think that, I trust these women. These are rich women. A woman who has a city of gold is a wealthy woman. She's classy. She's not going to need to take it off to show her friend. She's going to be more subtle, more classy. She's going to leave it on her head. We don't have to be concerned that she's going to take it off. So Rabbi Eliezer permitted. So between the two of them, says Rav Yosef, look at the difference. Rabbi Meir said prohibited. So I don't remember his reasoning, but he said it's just prohibited and it's a Torah violation. Rabbi Eliezer said permitted. So here's evidence where they were so far apart that one said permitted and the other one said it's a Torah violation. But the rabbi's answer, the answer to Rav Yosef is, yeah, but Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Eliezer were that far apart. But the rabbis had that in-between ruling. They said prohibited according to rabbinic decree, but it's not a Torah violation. So Rabbi Eliezer was not so far apart from the rabbis. Back to our case. Rabbi Eliezer said it's permitted to put the wine through that strainer on Shabbos as long as the strainer was suspended before Shabbos. The rabbis prohibit it, and it appears that if you do it, you're only violating a rabbinic prohibition, not a Torah prohibition, so you're not liable to bring the sin offering. Okay, back to tent making. So, we may not erect a tent, but what about things that are more similar to tent making than putting up a strainer? What about if you stretch like a clothesline, you hang a string from 2 points, and then you take a big cloak, like a poncho, like a blanket, and you hang it over the string, and so now you have like a shady area underneath. That feels like building a tent, and that is prohibited on Shabbos. But if you hang the string before Shabbos, and you take your cloak, which is just folded, and you hang it over the string, so the structure's already there, it's just like a folded garment on top of a string, then on Shabbos, when you need the shade, you can sort of unfold it the rest of the way, let the flaps come down. That's going to be permitted because you prepared for it before Shabbos. The structure already existed. You're just kind of unfolding the flaps on Shabbos. That is okay. So Rav is going to add some holdings here. As we heard, a folding bed cannot be unfolded on Shabbos. That's similar to making a tent in the space under the bed. This thing with the cloak over the fishing line, you can't create that ab initio on Shabbos. But if you created the basic structure before Shabbos, you can just finish unfolding it. A straight bed can be taken out. That's not going to be like creating a tent. and putting a canopy over a bed is going to be prohibited. There's like one exception. I'm not going to go into it, but there's so many, like, putting a canopy over a bed is only going to be possible if the center rail is thinner than a handbreadth and the slope is very steep and it goes to the sides of the bed, but not over the sides of the bed where it would create a tent underneath the bed, etc. It's almost prohibited, but if you really need that canopy over the bed for privacy or for mosquitoes or something like that, then you have to be very, very careful and consult the halacha before doing such a thing. We're just going to move on. Let me get this. A hat. So this comes up. This is so interesting. The question comes up. If you have a hat with a broad brim that keeps the sun off and you put it on Shabbos, did you just create a tent? So Rav Sheshet Bar, the son of Rav Edi, says you can put on a hat and don't worry about it, even if it has a pretty wide brim. But then the sages add, but if the brim is really wide, like more than a handbreadth wide, so then it is like making a tent. Others say, okay, the problem isn't how wide the brim is. The problem is that the hat could blow off. So this actually is the halacha. If you put a hat on to go outside on Shabbos to keep the sun off your head, for example, that hat has to either have a strap to hold it on to you or fit well. It has to be a good fit. The fear is that the wind will blow the hat off your head, and then you'll come to chase the hat, pick it up, and be carrying it. So it's a rabbinic prohibition that if you wear a hat on Shabbos, it must fit well, lest it blow off your head and you come to carry it. I think it was the beginning of a Coen Brothers movie, Miller's Crossing, right? Am I remembering this? He says that there's nothing less dignified than a man running after his hat. And I think the sages would agree. So you don't want to be in the situation of your hat blowing off your head and you chasing it and then coming to carry it in the public domain. Now that we're having this series of teachings, I'm not doing all of them, but there's a series about what's permitted and what's not, what's building a tent, what's not. So one of the sages asks Rav Huna to bring down some teachings in the name of Rav. And the first two have to do with making a tent. But the third one has to do with Torah. And this is what the title of today's show refers to. So let me get that in front of me. Okay. So with regard to Torah, now Rav Huna is going to bring down a teaching about Torah, not of Torah, but about Torah, in the name of Rav. So Rav Huna related that Rav said, the Torah is destined to be forgotten from the Jewish people. Now, think what we're doing here. We've now gone 200 days in a row. This is our 200th episode of AT Daily. We know there's Torah being taught all over the world. We know how seriously the sages took Torah. This would be a tragic statement for them to make. What is he saying? Why is he saying this? Listen to what he says. It is stated in the conclusion of the curses in the Torah's reproof. Right? So we see this in the Torah. This is at the end of the book that we just opened this week, Devarim, Deuteronomy, the fifth book of the Torah. This week's Torah portion is the first Torah portion in Devarim, in Deuteronomy. And toward the end of Deuteronomy, Moses says to the people, the whole book of Deuteronomy is basically a sermon by Moses. It's his farewell sermon, sort of recapitulating a lot of what they went through in the desert and what they learned and what happened and where they were and what the laws are. The 10 Commandments are restated. And then toward the end of the book, he says, look, if you follow these laws, if you follow this Torah that you've been given here in the wilderness, you, your fathers, personally, directly, God spoke to you. If you follow this Torah and your children and their children's children follow the Torah, you will be blessed in all your ways. And there's a whole list of blessings. But if you don't, if you abandon the teaching of your mothers and fathers, if you abandon the Torah, then a string of curses, terrible curses, will befall you. And ultimately, we did abandon the Torah, and that is why we lost the kingdom of Israel, and that is why the first temple was destroyed and why the second temple was destroyed. The first temple directly is because of sins against the Torah, and the second temple sins against each other in addition to the abandonment of Torah. And then for 2,000 years, we've been in diaspora, and all those curses have befallen us. They have befallen us. Now, we have not forgotten the Torah. So what is Rav saying? So it is stated at the conclusion of the curses in the Torah's admonition, quote, "And the Lord will make your plagues astonishing, and the plagues of your seed great plagues of long continuance, and evil diseases of long continuance." That's Deuteronomy 28:59. Now, this term, says Rav, of astonishment, mentioned in the verse, in addition to the explicit punishments, I do not know what it is. I don't know. Rav says, I don't know what God meant, what Moses said when he was speaking in God's name, that the Lord will make your plagues, the punishments because you abandoned Torah, he's going to make these plagues astonishing. What does astonishing mean? Rav says he doesn't know. He says he doesn't know. I don't know what it is. But when the verse states elsewhere, and now he goes to the book of Isaiah, the book of the prophet Isaiah, "Therefore, behold, I will continue to astonish this people with wondrous astonishment." The word astonish repeated. "And the wisdom of its wise will be lost, and the understanding of its men of understanding shall be hidden." So with regard to the use of the word astonishment in the verse from Isaiah, Rav says, you must say this astonishment is referring to the forgetting of Torah. The sages taught a similar idea in the Tosefta. When our sages entered the vineyard in Yavne, meaning when the temple was destroyed, and the sages who survived, thanks to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, moved the Sanhedrin, moved the seat of the sages from Jerusalem to the little town of Yavne, and were able to continue, the Sanhedrin continue Torah learning in Israel. Torah was not forgotten when the temple fell. In fact, it flourished. Now the sages took up the project in Yavne, and what did they do? They created Judaism, right? The Torah Judaism, of course, had already existed, but Judaism as we know it was created at that point because prayers already existed, the Torah existed, the Bible existed, everything existed, but still the religion was focused on the temple. It was focused on bringing offerings in the temple. Now they created Judaism the way we know it today, where the three times a day obligatory prayers replaced the offerings that were brought in the temple and many other practices like that. And they figured out everything. And what was their project where they figured out everything, what Judaism would look like after the temple? It's the Talmud. It's the Mishna. It's the Gemara. It's the Talmud. It's what we're studying now. So the sages taught, when our sages entered the vineyard in Yavne, they said, the Torah is destined to be forgotten from the Jewish people. As it is stated, behold, days are approaching, says the Lord God, and I will send forth a hunger in the land. This is from the prophet Amos. Not a hunger for bread and not a thirst for water, but for hearing the words of the Lord. That's from Amos 8:11. And it states, and they will drift from sea to sea, and from north to east they will roam to find the word of the Lord, but they will not find it. So it's predicting that a time will come where there won't be sages available for people who want to learn Torah, who want to hear the words of the Lord. They won't have from whom to learn it because the sages will have died out in Israel. Now, this does make sense when you're talking about the rabbis of the Mishna of the Gemara, because they watched Rome come, destroy the temple, destroy Jerusalem. They were allowed to survive, but the persecution got worse and worse and worse over that next 100 years. Terrible, terrible. And the only reason that the Mishna got written down, which was supposed to be an oral tradition that would never be written down, it was written down because they became afraid that all of the sages would be killed by the Roman persecution. And the people who had the whole Mishnah memorized in their heads would all be killed, and all that Torah would be lost. So when the sages said, it says in the Bible that it's destined to be forgotten, what they meant was, it's possible that the people who have it memorized and who are capable of memorizing it and understand it will all be killed. So we better write it down, at least the notes of it, the short version, the cryptic, coded, super condensed version, just in case we're all killed. The word of the Lord in this context bears many meanings. The word of the Lord, that is halacha, the law. The word of the Lord, that is the knowledge of when the Messiah will come, when we'll enter the end of days and we'll enter the Messianic age. Only God knows that. Nobody else knows that. We all thirst to know that. And the word of the Lord could mean prophecy, people who receive prophecy. And that did end. That ended in the Second Temple period. There was no more prophecy. The communication between God and the prophets was replaced by the sages finding God's will in the scripture as it already existed. So what they're basic, and then they say, well, what kind of wisdom is going to be lost? What's going to be absolutely lost from this world where people are going to need to know and they're not going to be able to find out? And they give some examples about some pretty specific laws about Tuma Tahara, about when teruma, the food given to the priest, when it has become disqualified. And it's the kind of law that really, the average Israelite doesn't know. It takes a sage to answer those tough questions. And the fear is that this prophecy of Amos is indicating that the sages will be lost from Israel. But an opposing view was taught in another baraisa. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says, heaven forbid that the Torah should be forgotten from the Jewish people, as it is stated, and this song shall answer to him as a witness, for it shall not be forgotten from his seed. That's Deuteronomy chapter 31:21. It says in the Torah that it will not be forgotten. Rather, how do I explain they will roam to find the word of God, but they will not find it? It means that they will not find clear laws and clear teaching together, but rather there will be dispute among the sages. So the forecast, the omen, the prophecy from Amos is a time will come where people can't get a clear reading of what the law is. And there will be disputes among the sages that are not resolved. Recall that when the temple stood, the sages would meet in the chamber of hewn stone in the temple. And when a question would come up, they'd argue it vociferously, passionately, argue, fight for their points of view. And at the end of the discussion, they would take a vote. And then they would say the law is like this. There was one central authority. After the temple fell, they tried to keep that central authority going. They did the best they could. But already there were two centers of Torah learning, one in the Holy Land, in Palestine, centered more or less around Jerusalem, but really in Yavne and a few of the other towns in the north. And another major seat of learning in Bavli, in Bavel, what is Iraq today, Babylonia. And the center of learning in the Holy Land faced such harsh persecution from the Roman Empire and the later Roman Empire that eventually it died off. And it was the central authority in Babylonia that ended up creating what we're learning here, Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud. So that was pretty much a central authority. And what they really did is they transmitted how we learn. And they transmitted a respect for the understanding of the earlier generations, always trying to have a unified Judaism. So now flash forward 2,000 years later, 1,500 years later, Do we have a centralized Judaism? Do we know what the law is? And you can argue this. You can argue this. Has Torah been forgotten from Israel? No, for sure not. There are so many dedicated communities that are just keeping it going. And there is a centrality to our understanding of Judaism because of the Talmud, because it was written down. First the Mishna and then the Gemara. And all of the studies around the world of serious Jews, even though we have different streams, we can have different denominations. We have a difference between Ashkenaz and Sephardic, etc. We have different communities with different customs. Nevertheless, they draw all of their understanding of what a Jew must do from the Talmud, and eventually was codified as the Shulchan Aruch. There were various codifications of exactly what is the law. And while, of course, there are differences, hey, there were differences back then too. We see arguments in the Mishnah, we see arguments in the Gemara, but the basic structure, the spine, is in place. Nevertheless, the warning is also in place. If we are so much at each other's throats, right? If we are Jew versus Jew and not a unified front, if we can't find a way to learn together, then we are in danger that Torah will be forgotten. And tragically, you're here learning with me. Thank God you're here learning with me. Many of us are learning together. Many Jews are taking Judaism and Torah seriously and learning around the world. But tragically, the big majority of Jews are totally disconnected from Torah Judaism around the world. They have forgotten Torah. It is not a part of their lives. And that is a dangerous state of being. I'm doing what I can by teaching here. You're learning from me. So I'm an accidental Talmudist. You bumped into me. You're an accidental Talmudist. You learned something that's meaningful to you. Please share any of these teachings, whatever is emotionally resonant for you. Share it with somebody that doesn't have Torah in their lives so that Torah is never forgotten from Israel. All right, let me look at your comments and questions. I hope a lot of people have found their way over here to YouTube. I'm so sorry that Facebook cut us off. It was a really bad day for Facebook today. We weren't able to post earlier our table for five, and we got cut off in the middle of the broadcast. I think we'll try to post later the second half of today's lesson on Facebook, and it will be available on our website at AT Daily on accidentaltalmudist.org. All episodes are available in the AT Daily section of accidentaltalmudist.org. Okay, I have just two questions here. Vaughn Billow says, what about erecting a tent for Sukkot? Well, the sukkah is not a tent, it's a booth, and we put it up before Sukkot, right? In fact, we start putting it up immediately after Yom Kippur, and it has to be finished before Sukkot begins, because that is definitely a real structure, and it would not be permitted to erect a sukkah on Sukkot. In fact, the question comes up, what if for some reason the person wasn't able to build it? He's got all the materials on hand, he wasn't able to build it. Let's say he was in the hospital, God forbid, and he comes home on Sukkot. Can he put up his sukkah so that he can perform the mitzvah of dwelling in his sukkah, of having a meal in his sukkah, or even sleeping in his sukkah? Answer, no. He has to wait till the third day after the festival days in the diaspora, the second day in Israel, and until we're in the intermediate days, which is not the festival itself, and put up his sukkah then. Pedro says, what if the strainer or even your tent that you set up before Shabbos comes somehow undone, unhooked, collapses, etc.? Would you be able to fix or reset them on Shabbos? So definitely not on Shabbos, because remember, we can't even strain the wine on Shabbos. The question is on the festival. The rabbi said we can't strain the wine on Shabbos. Only Eliezer said that, permitted that. So if the strainer, which we needed to build before the festival, not on the festival according to the rabbis, but we built it before the festival. We are allowed to strain wine through it on the festival. If it came unhooked. Excellent question. I'm not sure, so don't take my answer as the answer. I'm just riffing off the top of my head. It seems to me like because you prepared it before the festival, it was clearly prepared for the festival. And then I guess the question is, how much did it come undone? Did it just sort of like hang off, but it's still hanging there and you're just doing this, like an adjustment? I'm guessing that's probably okay. But if it falls all the way and it's like you now have to put it up again as if for the first time, probably not. But I'm not sure. It's an excellent question. I'm just not sure. That's what I've got. All right. If you are here, shkoyach, great job. We're learning together. It's our 200th episode. We got cut off halfway through on Facebook. If you came over from Facebook, that shows your thirst for Torah. That shows that Torah is not being forgotten in Israel. But if you've learned something that inspires you on any day of our teaching, please share with somebody that it might inspire them. That's so important to do. God willing, these Facebook problems will be fixed by tomorrow. God willing, everything will proceed as planned. But I think, God had a reason for cutting us off on Facebook today. Our joy was a little diminished. The challenge was increased. And that is definitely par for the course for these 9 days. We've got to keep our joy in check. And we've got to, really what it means is we have to keep our mind focused on the fact that the temple fell in the year 69 of the Common Era, and why. And also it fell at the end of the first temple. Why? Right? The first temple was mostly the big sins committed against people and against God, but major sins. And the second temple was because of baseless hatred among the Jews. Right? We couldn't get along with each other. We've got to do better, right? We can't become so polarized over any issues that we turn our back on our fellow Jew. We must do better than that. All right, my friends, with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow when